So that's how we can go from the Options API to the Composition API. Data is replaced with refs and reactive. Methods are replaced with functions, which you expose to the template by returning them in that object, which you return in setup. Computed is replaced with the computed function, and watchers are replaced with the watcher functions. Provide inject is replaced with the provide and inject functions. Now there's one more thing I want to dive into before we apply it all to a bigger project, and that are lifecycle hooks. There we have, for example, before create and created in the Options API, and we could simply add those methods to our config object. How does this look like with the Composition API? With the Composition API, we don't add those lifecycle hooks to our component config object anymore. Instead, we have functions which we can import from Vue, which you can call inside of the setup method. But for before create and created, there actually is no equivalent because these hooks are not needed here because the setup method basically runs at the same time before create and created ran in the past. So setup replaces these hooks. Whatever you would have done in created or before create should be done in the setup method itself. Now for before mount and mounted, it's different. There we have the on before mount and on mounted functions which can be imported from Vue. For before update and updated, it's similar, and the same for before unmount and unmounted. Here we have on before unmount and on unmounted. So you see a pattern here. Let's now also have a look at that in code. Back here, let's say in the user data component, as I mentioned, we're now not going to add created and mounted and so on here to our options object. Instead, we're going to add them here in setup by importing the required hooks. Now, as I mentioned, there is no on before create and so on, but there is a on before mount, there is a on mounted, on before update, on updated, and on before unmount, as well as on unmounted. And I quickly restructure this to make it easier to read. These are the lifecycle hook functions which we can import from Vue. Now, how do we use them in setup? In setup, you simply call them, like for example, on before mount, like this, and you pass a function to them. And this function will now be executed whenever this lifecycle hook is due. So here I can console log before mount or on before mount, whatever you want. And we can now repeat this. We also have on mounted. So here I will print on mounted. We also have on before update. So we print on before update. We have on updated. So here we can print on updated. And we have on before unmount and print on before unmount, as well as here on unmounted. Here on unmounted and print on unmounted. And if we now saved it all and reload, we see on before mount and on mounted here. If I clear the console and click change age, we also see on before update, then our watcher runs, and then on updated thereafter, once the update was applied to the template and to the real DOM. Well, and for unmounting, we would need to get rid of user data, which we can do with an if statement, for example, with vif. If we now had some condition here that could get false, this component would be removed from the DOM, and when that happens, the on unmount hooks would be called. But I think the pattern should be clear here. We see those logs here, and we see that this is how you can register code that should be executed at different phases of the life cycle of a component. You simply call those special functions which you import from Vue, and you pass your function that holds your to-be-executed code to those functions. And that's how you work with lifecycle hooks in the composition API.